Hi everyone, Al McCoff here. Today I'm going to be looking at Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn from a gaming perspective. Following this notice, however tongue-in-cheek it may have been, I'm not going to be looking at motives and morals. What I will talk about are some of the scenes that Sir Samuel Clemens sets in the story, and the structure within which he sets them. I'm not going to give a synopsis of the entire book, or spoil a lot of the key scenes, but you should get a certain sense of what it's about by the time we're through. In terms of structure, one thing I'd like to point out is just how episodic it is. There are many, many distinct little stories told along the overarching thread. I will say that the two main characters of the story, Huck Finn and Jim, are on their way down the Mississippi River. For Jim, it's to find his wife and children who have been sold off as slaves. And for Huck, it's to find any old place to go, as he, early on in the story, has feigned his own death. Let's dig into a few of those tasty scenarios, shall we? One scene in Huckleberry Finn takes place in a full 2-story house set adrift on the river, floating rapidly downstream, tilted on its side, its contents in disarray, and what looks like a murder has taken place. You can see the remains of sinful life, innocence gone astray, the wrong place at the wrong time. A calico dress, a baby's bottle, gamblers' cards, bandits' masks, a body. At one point, Huck and Jim reach a steamboat that's killed itself upon a rock. Stuck there, but someone's inside. Living bandits, it turns out. Making their final plays before the boat is swept up in the storm raging and falls to pieces, capsized. Nearly every situation in the book comes preloaded with tension. It's precarious and barely balanced, ready for something to tip the scales just as the protagonist makes his way there. It's a powder keg, a rotting floorboard, a branch full of leaves just ready to drop. Assuming, of course, that we regard that leaf as a precious lifeline, or the key to our genius plan. It's abundantly clear that the events in the book have been influenced by the past. Both past events on the landscape and past activities of the inhabitants. Both past inhabitants and current ones. Everything leaves a mark. And each one of those marks has a story attached to it. Significant or not. Every single action by every single creature in history adds to an incredibly multifaceted web of the past. And all of these events build up like weight, a burden, or a blessing. Mostly a burden in a story like this. And this burden, this weight, exacts a force on the scene. This force is like gravity. Gravity paired with rotting wood. The timbers of lifetimes. It's on these timbers that everything rests. The tension, understandably, is enormous. Everything involved is just dangling in the wind. Everything is perched like this. On a log about to crumble. In a tree that's poised to tumble. Behind a dam about to burst. And whether it's clear at first or not, everything ties back to that ever-flowing river. As a side note, it usually is pretty clear. It's a central element to the story, and the story would not be the same without it. There's one thing the river does, it's provide structure. The river is the fastest way for Huck and Jim to move, and they need to move. So, it acts like roots forming steps up an otherwise formidably steep hill. It guides the action in a subtle way, leading the protagonists where they need to go. It's a crude but effective way to enforce destiny. If you haven't guessed, at this point I most certainly am looking at this from a pen and paper RPGer's perspective. So, if the party's goal is to move from here all the way down south, then they're much more likely to take the route that will let them travel this far in a day, than the route that will let them go maybe at that rate. And because of how beautifully incentivized this river travel is, they're much more likely to encounter Plan A, Scene B, all these things that you're able to prepare much more linearly than you normally would be able to trust in your adventure. This isn't to say that they can't go on their own little diversions, it's just that eventually it'll all lead back to the main, obvious route. Of course, it helps to have a clear goal so that even if they go off on these, well, little diversions, there's always a reason for them to keep pushing onward and upward. This also means that you can plan out very distinct moments of choice, and yet still trust that they will come back to your primary thread to meet that tempting goal you've so wisely placed at the end. Of course, laying this all out so clearly sort of kills the beauty of it. The whole point is that you can have more of a plan than you normally would in a sandboxy, character-driven adventure, while still making it feel very natural. And a lot of that natural feeling comes down to having whatever your players encounter in the game have a very clear place in the world, and the sense that it's pre-existing, that whether or not they ran into it, it was always there. Try to instill this sense of history even in the things you improvise. They will bring, again, that sense of weight to both your non-player and player characters, the world around them. When creating these people and places with history, remember that history isn't a strictly passive thing. It's also active and constant. When we encounter the Grangerford household in the book, we both learn about their deceased daughter, Emmeline, who was a promising poet and artist for her age. We also find out that there's a long-standing feud between the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons, and that this is still going on. And, again, like many things in the story, the protagonist does walk in on a somewhat critical point in its history. Through play, we can find out what happens at this tipping point, who's left standing, and where things go from there. If there is something to build on, and the players want to stick around to see what can be made of it, it can be good to follow that new direction. But remember, it's equally likely that they'll want to carry on down that river, that plot thread, to whatever's next on their journey to the primary goal. We eventually see one town in the book that's built on a flat of black mud. Its houses raised on stilts to avoid having them swept away by the river. It's a place of festering disrepair, both in construction and socially. Its residents seem half mad knowing there's really nowhere to go in life. And Colonel Sherburne gives you the perfect picture of Southern justice. Well, perhaps not a completely fair depiction of Southern justice, but he does paint a good picture of mob mentality in a small, isolated town. If you're interested in featuring not just one-to-one interpersonal conflicts, but also conflicts with society as a larger structure, it can be useful to have a good set of examples as to what that society could look like in its ideal state or in disrepair. Setting aside all of these specific events and places, there are lots of underlying elements we can draw inspiration from. Elements that also help bring the world to a new level of life and vividness. On a cultural level, we find out about all sorts of little superstitions, including myriad routes to misfortune, such as touching a snake skin, or seeing the new moon over your shoulder, or killing a spider without immediately afterwards walking in a circle 3 times and crossing your heart as you do so. But there are also subtler, even more mysterious superstitions explored. At one point, Jim asks questions of a spirit within a bazaar, placing his ear against the hairball, letting the spirit speak to him, providing answers from beyond. Another immersive aspect of the writing is that the weather plays a real effect on the world. A storm can rage and the river can rise, or a fog can roll in, lending an eerie atmosphere to early morning or deep night. And this atmosphere isn't strictly cosmetic. It can make navigation extremely perilous. And it can close off your field of view and shrink your world so that what you're left with is something very personal and potentially very frightening. In the book, a fog isolates Jim from Huck for a while, which makes for a very tense and frightening scene as they careen down the Mississippi. Of course, this is slightly more difficult to pull off in a pen and paper role-playing game, where splitting the party is a difficult thing to manage without boring your players. But if you are able to keep that tension up, and keep them worried and wondering, it could be very worth it. To recap, I'm going to run through some of the reasons that I think any gamer or game designer would be served well by looking at this book, giving it a read through. Firstly, the episodic nature ties in beautifully with the way games flow, and the living worlds that Mark Twain presents, full of history and just variation and preloaded stakes, is magnificent and something to aspire towards. The rich locales that are presented are the sort of thing that anyone building an adventure, whether that's a linear adventure game or something that players are going to come in and build on in a more flexible way, should be envious of and should probably steal freely from. Then there is just the structure of guided but significant choice that the book gives us throughout the entire thread. And because it is a thread, aside from all that though, it's just a wonderful piece of work and very much worth reading. I only read the book for the first time a few months ago, and I've gotta say, I felt like I'd been missing out. But I think I'd also have missed out on something if I had read it much earlier, too. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed the show. And I hope you enjoy the book as much as I have. Thank you for watching.